Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second session of our Aquinas at 800 conference. Thank you all so much for coming. This is the History of Philosophy, Aquinas and Late Antique Philosophy session. Our first speaker today will be Father Raymund Snyder, who is currently teaching philosophy and Latin in the Faculty of Philosophy at the Pontifical University of St. Aquinas in Rome. He's also a doctoral candidate in philosophy, writing on Aquinas' reception of Proclus's Elements of Theology. The title of his talk today is Implicit Use of Proclus in the De Substantiis Separatis. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Grayden. And there's also a handout for my talk. And I put at the bottom, if you're interested in the full paper, a link to a URL, I should say a URL that has the full paper. So feel free, Ed, to read the full paper if you're interested, and I'd love to hear feedback. I want to thank the organizers, especially in arranging the panel sessions in such a way that we can have like talks connected together, so I'm pleased to be a part of this session in particular. I am going to move through, you'll find on the handout an outline, and I'm going to move through the first two sections relatively quickly, so I hope you'll forgive me for that, because I feel that the last section will have the broadest appeal and is really, to my mind, one of the most curious passages in Aquinas that I've ever found. So we'll try to focus on De Substantiis Separatis chapter 3 and the implications it has for Aquinas' positions. The claim that certain Neoplatonic influences and themes can be found in the works of Aquinas is nothing new. For example, Chanut's theory of the so-called exitus reditus scheme of the Summa, whether true or not, has become a commonplace in presentations on Aquinas. And discussions abound concerning the degree to which Aquinas' metaphysics of participation is derivative from Platonic sources. After surveying quite a bit of the literature on Platonism and Aquinas, it's my conviction that the scholarly discussion could benefit from a closer consideration of exactly how Platonic notions were transmitted to Aquinas, specifically when he read certain texts and where the reception of these ideas might be found in his corpus. Now, one of the most important of these texts was made available to Aquinas only in 1268, 6 years before his death, thanks to a translation by William of Marbeck, and that is Proclus's Elements of Theology. Who was Proclus? Well, the school of Athens flourished under Proclus's tenure in the 5th century AD, during which time he composed an ample corpus of commentaries, which were themselves all very long, cataloging a number of sources, going through a number of authorities. But one of his briefest works and unique works, the Elements of Theology, is the one in which he attempted to establish the essential outlines of the supersensible reality without appeal to authorities, but instead proceeding more geometrico, as much as the subject matter permitted. St. Thomas read Proclus's Elements closely sometime during his second Parisian regency, and as a result was able to definitively show that the Liber de Causis was not a work of Aristotle, but of a, quote, Arabic philosopher who adapted and altered Proclus's Elements. Aquinas demonstrated this textual genealogy in his Super Librum de Causis Expositio, his commentary, a work that includes many explicit citations of Proclus to clarify the otherwise puzzling language and ideas of the De Causis. Now, this interpretive work alone constitutes a major accomplishment in the study of the history of philosophy. Alan de Libera has remarked that it was akin to the work of a Renaissance humanist. Aquinas was doing something like 200 or 300 years ahead of his time. And so he ought to be given the title, the first historian of late antique philosophy. A close reading of the Super Librum de Causis shows that Proclus's Elements did more than just permit Aquinas to disprove the Aristotelian authorship of the De Causis. He also acquired a comprehensive vision of the late Platonic system, and by that I mean the system coming after Iamblichus. He grasped the outline of this complex system of immaterial realities that proceed from the transcendent one good. That's one hyphen good I have, as I referred to it. Taking Proclus as a representative of Platonism in general, Aquinas indicates that the Platonic position was actually founded on a few core convictions. At least that's how he distills the system. He argues that the more universal and common a thing is for the Platonists, the more prior it is in reality. And so it's endowed with more perfections and entrusted with a providential care over its inferiors. One may follow the logic to the very top of the system, where the one good has an ultimate priority, so much so that it is unparticipated and is divine in a way that exceeds even the other inferior divinities. And so this cascade of power flows from the one, but is reified at various levels through a reversion. And so it forms altogether a complete scale of perfections. Personally, I have a strong conviction that we shouldn't call thinkers before Dionysius, we shouldn't say that they have a hierarchy in the strict sense, that being really a Dionysian neologism. And so you'll find me alluding to a scale of excellences or a scale of perfections, and that's what I have as, because if we were to take Proclus's words, we would use the word taxis or sera for a series. Okay, what else does Aquinas detect of the Platonic system by reading Proclus's Elements? Well, perhaps most importantly, he's able to construct a fourfold order, what he calls the fourfold Platonic order. Perhaps the most useful notion he drew from Proclus, because it's the one that allowed him to create a coherent divisio textus of the De Causis, the most useful idea he takes from Proclus, perhaps. And so we might ask ourselves, did Aquinas have occasion to put this new knowledge about Platonism to use? Did he have occasion to make reference to this system and its structure? And what I'm arguing today is that he did, most especially or most visibly in the De Substantiis Separatis. And so I'll be focusing on those beginning chapters of the treatise on separate substances and trying to draw out just where we might find Aquinas' reception of Proclus even without his name. Now, if you've ever read the De Substantiis Separatis, you'll know that it has a number of unique features. Aquinas manifests a profound historical interest, and one that exceeds the typical endoxa, doxography at the beginning of works, because it occupies a full 4 chapters. So he has much more historical knowledge and you might say concern than elsewhere we find. He also attempts to set Plato and Aristotle in a kind of fundamental agreement as a kind of dual philosophical magisterium against which all other subsequent opinions can be judged. And so I'll begin just simply by situating the De Substantiis. When did Aquinas write it, and what exactly was going on at that point? Many scholars have pointed out, this is part 1 now if you're following the outline, many scholars have pointed out that there's a close relationship between the commentary on the De Causis and the De Substantiis Separatis, placing them more or less all in agreement, being written around the same time. But I think it's most useful to think of the De Substantiis being written after Aquinas has really mastered the content of the Elements of Theology, which he did in the course of composing the commentary on the De Causis. And what leads us to believe that? Well, more or less, Fabro and Henley, who are the 2 scholars I'm going to be mentioning, they assert this, but I don't think in their works do they really demonstrate it definitively. And so part of what I hoped to do was to really show, even proposition by proposition, if you read the full text, you'll find ample reference to particular propositions of the elements that we see Aquinas using. Aside from their general attitude, the comments they make about the importance of the De Substantiis, and some footnotes in the Leonine edition and Lesko's translation, there's really nothing else that I've managed to find that draws a direct connection between Proclus and the De Substantiis, proposition by proposition, at the level of propositions. So there's not a lot that's been done on this, but I think, especially with that first chapter, which I'm going to go through quickly, it's the easiest case to make. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say not just particular pieces of content in that first chapter, but even the first chapter as a whole reflects something of the structure of Proclus's Elements, because we more or less see Aquinas articulate the general laws, so to speak, or the governing principles of the Platonic system, and then delineate the different grades of that scale of excellences. So, many have suggested that that there's a connection between these texts, but few have zeroed in on it in particular. I want to, before I get into the text, just highlight the difference between Fabro and Henley's interpretations, because they have what I would call a material agreement but a formal disagreement. They both agree that Aquinas uses Proclus more concisely and freely and interestingly in the De Substantiis Separatis than even he does in the Commentary on the De Causis. But they disagree about the meaning this has in Aquinas' corpus. Henley downplays the importance of it, saying, well, this was a Platonic project, more or less, but we see the same consistent anti-Platonic strain in Aquinas. Fabre, on the other hand, sees it as a real development in the thought of Aquinas. And so there's these interpretive poles that we can kind of set up and as we begin to look at this text. So, chapters 1 and 2 of De Substantiis Separatis, well, what do we see there? We see Aquinas, first of all, articulating his project, which is to consider what human thought has already considered concerning immaterial substances. Has this famous prologue where he mentions that because he can't be there in choir with the friars to praise the angels, it's fitting that he praise them in his writings. But even in that same phrase, we see that it's his project to accept what we find to be in agreement with the faith and reject what is repugnant to Catholic doctrine concerning the angels. This artful incipit should not distract us from the fact that it really does articulate the purpose of the work, which is to consider received opinion. That's a major feature of the work. Aquinas enters into the pre-Socratics, speaks about them for a moment, but then introduces Plato as an epistemological breakthrough, one who had a place in his system for immaterial realities and had a governing principle. And this is now the first text you have. I'll just begin to consider that, the first block text you have on the handout. Additionally, Plato established a certain order among species. For Plato, and that quote begins, to the degree that something was simpler in the intellect, it held precedence in the order of things. So, precedence in intellect has a one-to-one correlation with precedence or priority in reality. And this then is the principle, what I've been calling in what I've written so far, the Platonic priority thesis. And Aquinas goes back to this again and again. It's that by which the Platonists both arrived ultimately at a highest principle, but also articulated the different grades subsequent to that highest principle, down to the level of bodies. And so if you were to read chapter 1 of the De Substantiis, you would see basically all of those core features of the late Platonic system Aquinas has now mastered, if I can put it that way, and he articulates them very smoothly. You know, the commentary on the De Causis is a difficult read, and you need to know about Proclus, about the De Causis itself, and a little bit about what Aquinas is doing and how he's using Dionysius. The De Substantiis Separatis, chapter 1, is a breeze to read by comparison, and a delight. And we see Aquinas attributing to Plato himself a lot of these positions, which probably now we would recognize are really proper to the late Platonic system. So when he mentions Plato, we should also keep in mind Proclus, because that's one of his privileged sources for these claims, these somewhat shocking claims at times he's making about Plato. So in that first chapter alone, he goes through and rehearses some of the most essential points that he has already articulated in the De Causis commentary. He also includes a few more levels of detail, and that's why I've drawn that chart for you on the back side of the handout, just to indicate that he's elaborated a little bit more on the fourfold Platonic order, as he had already described it in the commentary on the De Causis. He elaborates a little bit more, obviously because the work in question is about immaterial substances. So he spends a little bit more time on Neoplatonic demonology, or I should call it daimonology. And to go into more detail, I would need to talk about those theories. He also introduces the theory of the vehicular body, one of the more interesting, controversial things about the late Platonic system. So he's actually adding more that he didn't have occasion to introduce in the commentary on the De Causis. So I've gone through this chapter 1 very quickly because I think it's the easiest case to make. And I now want to turn really to chapter 3, because there we see a very surprising Aquinas. We see Aquinas introducing a kind of twin doctrine of Plato and Aristotle in 3 essential ways. So rather than a real straightforward account of Plato and Aristotle, these are Aquinas' own original synthesis. And effectively, the reasoning goes like this. Because Plato and Aristotle agreed so much on the highest God and first principle, they agreed a great deal on the other immaterial substances, the angels. And we might question both of those premises, and that's just fine. I'm not arguing necessarily that Aquinas is being a faithful exegete of either source. I simply think it's interesting to see what he's doing and what he thinks he's doing. So, the 3 points of convergence he identifies in Plato and Aristotle is one that's basically based on the convertibility of the transcendentals. I thought was an uncontroversial topic until today. I guess it's a much more controversial one than I thought. Also, a kind of doctrine of potency and act that he finds in either thinker and participation. And similarly, a doctrine of providence that he finds in either thinker. With the time that I have, I definitely want to focus on the first two. I may not make it to the third, just to give you a warning. So the second text in your handout really begins that first point of convergence. So I've given you the full text there. Plato held that all inferior immaterial substances were one and good by participating in the first immaterial substance, which is the one itself and the good itself. Moreover, anything that participates in something receives what it participates from that which it participates in. And to the degree that it participates in that thing is its cause, just as air has participated light from the sun, which is the cause of its being illuminated. In such a way, therefore, according to Plato, the highest God is the cause for all immaterial substances that makes all of them to be both one and good. Aristotle also holds this, since, as he says, it is necessary that whatever is maximally being and maximally true be the cause of being and the truth of all other things. So here, not only do we have a pretty bold claim made about Plato's theology, we also have followed up immediately by a bold claim about Aristotle's agreement with this theory. So there's several swift strokes of logic in this dense passage. It's unsurprising for us, if we've read the commentary on the De Causis, to see him ascribe a notion of a primal God. At least to Proclus, we see him do that very frequently. Here now he has it from Plato. He moves, though, from that Platonic priority thesis back up to the primal God, and then with an unfolding scale of excellences. So those are the three, I think, core ideas from the De Causis commentary, and they follow a kind of pattern. He articulates the core principle, then shows they used it to arrive at a highest principle, the one good, and that on the basis of that principle, unfolding from the one good, there's an entire scale of excellences. Now here, what's interesting is that scale is articulated in terms of participation. So the separate substances are lesser participations in the one good. They utterly depend upon him for their unity and goodness. Now this conformity with Aristotle is perhaps the most arresting part, because he says that in a certain sense, Aristotle has a notion of participation included in his notion of efficient causality. Just as maximal being is the cause of all lesser beings, all beings participate in the first maximal being. This should sound somewhat familiar to the Fourth Way, because there Aquinas is a lot writing on the so-called principle of the maximum. So we see him using that as a kind of Aristotelian on-ramp to bring things together with Plato. Aquinas implies that there's an Aristotelian scale of truth that can be set in correspondence with the Platonic scale of excellences. So for both philosophers, inferior principles have a partial share in the fullness and perfection of the highest principle. So the hidden premise then is that the transcendental properties of being, I guess I have to edit that part, certain things about being, one and good, hold place and can be seen in tandem with truth and maximal being. We could go further, talking about chapter 11 of the De Substantiis. I have to omit that from this paper, where Aquinas goes into the noetic triad, the so-called noetic triad of being, life, and intellect. More or less to set an agreement, Platonic claims with Aristotelian ones, to say that we can all agree that being itself is the cause of all beings, and life itself is the cause of all living things, and intellect itself is the cause of all intellects. Whether all of those are the same thing, who is also God, well, we can debate about that. But that's more or less the argumentation, is that we can see a congruity in these theories if we understand that principle of the maximum doing a lot of the work. Moving quickly now to that second point of convergence, maybe even a more surprising one. Taking then that text, everything that participates, this is the third text you have, everything that participates must be composed of potency and act, for whatever is received as participated must be the act of some participating substance. And thus, since all substances, except for the highest, which is one per se and good per se, are participants, according to Plato, they must all necessarily be composed of potency and act. It is also necessary to say this according to the words of Aristotle, for he held that the first truth and first goodness must necessarily be pure act, but whatever falls short of this must have some admixture of potency. So here we have Aquinas saying what sounds like a mistake in an introduction to philosophy class. Oh yeah, Plato had a doctrine of potency and act, and Aristotle had a doctrine of participation. It looks as though he's crossed his wires, but he means what he says, and he has a very clear point to be made, that we can see a kind of joint truth in this twin magisterium of philosophical authority. At least, and this is, I think, perhaps the more accurate way to think about it, is Aquinas is validating these philosophers relative to the truth of his own theory, and as men of his own time would do, using the authorities and commentaries on them as a way to present one's own position. Now, Aquinas has a conviction, and we may agree with him, that this is his own theory, his own interpretation is closer to the truth, and that's part of what enables him to have a free hand in using these sources. The third point of convergence is actually a little bit harder to see and has to do with basically a general scale of providence. That's one of the ways that Aquinas is able to understand divinity in the late Platonic system. He says, they call divine that which has a providential role, i.e. a causal role over its inferiors. And so he articulates elements of Aristotle's political and anthropological doctrine in which there are masters with inferiors below, and that actually mistakes or less perfect execution of tasks enters in at the lower level. Just as in the Platonic scale, you see the bad demons only show up towards the bottom, in other words, when there's some association with matter. So those are the 3 points of convergence. Obviously, it's followed immediately by a fourth chapter in which he clarifies at some level and says we need to see there are points of disagreement between Plato and Aristotle. So we have to keep that qualification in mind. But even just on the basis of these things, I want to draw some conclusions by bringing things back to that interpretation we see between Fabro and Henley, that material agreement but formal disagreement. Where might we locate ourselves in light of this analysis? I should say, first of all, this is of course incomplete, as a brief paper can only be, but the next steps to complete this would really be to look at chapter 11, as I've mentioned, and also Simplicius's commentaries on the categories and on the De Coelo, because I think Aquinas gets not only a great deal of knowledge about late antiquity and late ancient philosophy from him, he also is influenced by Simplicius's own tendency to concordize. And I've given you, at least in the full paper, I have a link to Wayne Hankey's paper on that, which I think is just a great first start, but much more needs to be done to have a complete sense. What about Fabro and Henley? How do we understand these passages? Are they an isolated Platonic excursus that Aquinas did one day, or do they represent real philosophical development? I'm much more sympathetic to Fabro's position, that we have reason to believe that this represents Aquinas, in light of actually newfound historical knowledge, is making a new systematic claim. And we can see him as an excellent representative of the mutual symbiotic relationship between historical and systematic studies, because he's actually gaining historical knowledge, but it allows him to go a little bit further in his systematic argumentation. That's how I prefer to see it. We have no reason to believe that Aquinas doesn't mean what he says in this treatise, even if it seems strange on first reading. And we have Proclus's elements, and I know I've talked very little about that. I've had to skip over some of this, but you can see those same moves being made in Proclus's elements. The association of causality with potency and act. He's discussing that. Propositions 77 through 79. Also, in the way in which the principle of the maxima is put to work. And we can look closely at some of those propositions. So I think, aside from Simplicius, which I think is very likely, Proclus's elements is actually driving Aquinas' tendency to see things as one kind of joint doctrine, or at least to begin a step of harmonizing the two doctrines. Thank you. Would you like to field the questions? You can keep track of how long people's hands have been up. So.
I think we have a microphone. So I saw your hand first.
Thank you, Father Raymund. That was it's always good when Proclus is talked about, So I mean, I have a somewhat of a, well, I have two questions. The first one feels a little broad, but since the talk was broad, I think it's productive to ask it. In that there is this debate in scholarship on Proclus's elements, right, about how you're supposed to understand the structure, right? And it there's one way of understanding it that actually seems to mirror how Aquinas talks about what the Platonists do, right? And that you move quickly to a first principle, then you ascend up there, and then you gradually descend, sort of working out the structure of the chain of being as you go down. And that's normally taken like elements 1 through 6 or 1 through 7, et cetera, is like the initial ascent, or maybe even like 1 and 2. And then once you get up to, say, element 102, then you sort of start this gradual descent, right? Till you're at the level of the human soul, sort of just before the material world starts. But there are other ways to divide up the elements, and there are other ways to think about what their purpose is. Are they trying to replace Aristotle's metaphysics? Are they just a therapeutic book? So the actual question I'm getting to is then, do you feel like you could sort of slot Aquinas into one of these sort of modern options of how to interpret the elements? Do you have a sense of what he actually thinks Proclus's project in the elements as a whole is, and how they're structured based on the Liber de Causis and the De Substantiis Separatis?
Thank you for that question. That's excellent. And I'm most familiar with some of the more recent arguments that have been made in a volume in French edited by Aubry.
Yep.
And so I've kind of been influenced by Jan Opsimer's reading and Lernoux, if I'm saying his name right, yes, actually those first 4 propositions talk about unity and multiplicity, but it's not really till 5, I believe, that the one makes his appearance. And then quickly, although by the time you get to 13, it's clear that the one is the one good. I do think that Aquinas doesn't follow that, let's say, exactly, but I do think he's kind of distilled. We think of a work that itself is so concise and dense. And here's Aquinas saying, okay, but here's 3 principles that really help us identify all these things. That what I've dubbed, in his words, or I should say what I have dubbed, the principle that he doesn't have a label for, but I wish he did because it takes a full sentence to mention, the Platonic priority thesis. That's the short title, the Platonic priority thesis. I think he finds that, and he's working it out in some of the first propositions from the elements, and he applies it and uses it. So I'm basically in the same ballpark as you, thinking about 1 through 13 as a kind of hermeneutic key for the rest. I have that on page 24 if you want to write it down, of the full talk. So anyway, I don't know that he has a theory that would be significant vis-a-vis the modern theories, which are already more detailed. But I do think we can see him as like a decent interpreter of Proclus, a very good interpreter of the De Causis for what it is and for what a mystery it is, and a decent interpreter of Proclus. That's kind of how I see Aquinas. So.
And could I ask, since I have the microphone, I just
Sure,
want to ask one quick question. Right, so in the De Causis commentary, he uses Pseudo-Dionysius to criticize the Liber de Causis, but that's not the only way to relate the two. Albert really sees them as like kind of in harmony. They're both sort of attempts to reform a more pagan Platonic system or something. Do you see in the De Substantiis Separatis that is he using Pseudo-Dionysius, do you think, differently from the way it's in the De Causis commentary or not?
He uses Dionysius some, but I think he's holding back on him to the end, to the part that he didn't finish, to really go through the theological material. And he mentions Dionysius as, along with Augustine, he really mentions Dionysius as the angel authority. And I feel like he's holding him back a little bit to that part he never gets to. The using of him is much more clear in the commentary on the De Causis. And even these curious passages, I don't know if you're familiar with, where he says, Dionysius corrects Proclus. And our minds go, wait a second. He figured it out. Long before the 19th century Jesuits did, and demonstrated that Dionysius is dependent on Proclus. But I actually think it's important to remember he doesn't have an accurate chronology. So for all he knows, Proclus did precede Dionysius in time. So that's just an added thing there. Go ahead, please. Or whoever's next.
Since we're doing Q&A after, do one of you have to run? And
I'm happy to defer if it's pressing. Thank you for that talk. I I also think that Simplicius in the background is worthy of investigation. The question of harmonization is important, but I'm thinking also Simplicius's harmonization is one that actually kind of subsumes Aristotle to higher Platonic principles. It's not, bring them up on the same level, as it were. And I'm wondering if there's something different at work, though, in the passages that you gave us of the De Substantiis, insofar as, so I'm with you, I'm on board with you of the elements of theology being at work in his reasoning through the system of causality and participation of Aristotle and Plato in the text. But what strikes me in both of the passages that you give us for the account of participation, it's a participation of two terms, right? It's of the participated and the participant. And there is no unparticipated, at least in the passages that you've given us. So what's missing is propositions 23, 24 of the elements of theology, where the real emphasis on the unparticipated for it to work. So what we have there is maybe a kind of harmonization that is still taking, maybe it's notes from the Liber de Causas. I'd be curious to hear what Professor Taylor has to say about this, but that still sees kind of the first principle as an ontological first principle that is participated, or maybe taking notes too from the De Hebdomadibus, specifically to understand how goods are related to the good. But it's not full. It doesn't seem to be articulating the Proclean position.
I think there's two other places. Certainly, I agree that Aquinas moves away from the trifold participation of Proclus. In fact, one of the questions I had going in the dissertation was, what's he going to do with this? When I look at these passages at the end of the day, and Fabro felt very strongly about this. He thought that basically a threefold model of participation threatens the Christian distinction, and so it needs to be contained and dealt with. And we see, so the short answer to your question is the next place to look is chapter 9, I believe, from De Substantiis itself, when he really goes into participation. That often gets a lot of the attention, if I have it correct. But also in the commentary on the De Causis itself, when he more or less acknowledges this threefold model of participation, tries to accommodate it in some very mild way, as any commentator would do, but acknowledges that basically at the end of the day, it's reduced to an effect-cause model that maps onto participated and participating.
In some capacity, even the account we have of a sort of Platonic dualism from Aristotle himself in the Metaphysics might be the more appealing Platonism for him to try to accommodate the two, as opposed to the Proclus's.
Yeah. I just found that, I'll say this and maybe it covers quite a bit. Every time I thought Aquinas had this work and he didn't know how to read it because he didn't know, every time we have the suspicion, he didn't know what he was looking at, he didn't have any of the context. Every time I think that, he makes some comment in the commentary on the De Causis that indicates actually a pretty profound and mostly accurate understanding of the work. And that's where I agree with like Leo Elders and others who have said that the commentary on the De Causis is almost as much a commentary on Proclus as it is on the De Causis. And so I think those are kind of useful. But there's quite a bit there. It just needs to be rearranged and looked through. And he more or less does comment on just about every feature of Proclus's structure and system and says something mostly accurate about it. Impressive for his time to only have one work. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for those questions. And as I said before, but some of you came in late, we don't have a third speaker, so we'll invite our speakers back up to field further questions after our next paper, which is from Rebecca Hicks, who is a PhD candidate at the University, or St. Louis University. She's working on Platonic and Aristotelian traditions in ancient, late antique, and medieval philosophy. Her paper is Simplicius and Calcidius, Transmissions of Plato's Timaeus to Aquinas. Please join me in welcoming her.
So I think the organizers of this conference appear to be very wise and skilled in regards to who they're pairing together, because Father Snyder and I appear to have been reading all of the same things. However, I took a departure from the things I've normally read about in regards to Aquinas in the past, and instead of engaging with his engagement with Neoplatonists, I tried to see what I could make of one particular aspect of his direct engagement with Plato. There have been many moments where I regretted my topic choice, but I hope we will find something interesting out of this. Okay. For contemporary scholars of Plato, the main source for Plato's thought is, of course, first and foremost, Plato's own dialogues, particularly in the English-speaking world after the influence of Charinus, who perhaps went a little too far in his harshness, but I think said some very truthful things about the futility of an attempt to accurately reconstruct Plato's unwritten doctrines. Of course, secondary sources can still influence Platonic scholarship. First and foremost among those secondary sources is, of course, Aristotle himself. There are points in which Aristotle's writings about Plato seem to come in conflict with what is found in Plato's dialogues. Just as a side note, I would recommend Gail Fine as a scholar who somehow manages to find interpretations according to which Aristotle is reporting on Plato accurately, and somehow manages to apply the principle of charity to both of them, even when acknowledging that they disagree. Okay. Of course, Thomas Aquinas lived a very different historic period, and he did not enjoy our advantages of being able to find multiple translations or Greek editions of each of Plato's dialogues. Of course, it may, however, still be of interest to any Thomist who is also interested in Plato, the question of whether or not Thomas could have read any of Plato's dialogues. I believed a few months ago when I was working on this paper that I would answer the question, and I still have not found a definitive answer, but I will take you through my journey. For which reason I'm not reading my paper directly because I'm still not satisfied with it, but I am presenting its current contents. There are exactly 3 dialogues of Plato's which Aquinas possibly could have read. The Meno, the Phaedo, and the Timaeus. These were the 3 dialogues which did exist in Latin translations in Western Europe. There is next to no evidence that Aquinas read the Meno or the Phaedo. He does mention each by name. Since I'm not reading directly from the paper, I'm afraid it escapes my memory where he mentions the Meno, but without further elaboration in his contents. And he does mention the Phaedo at a place where Aristotle himself mentions it. But again, he does not go further into the contents. And the Phaedo would probably, it is not possible that Aquinas could have read the Phaedo early on for philosophical reasons, which I will omit for reasons of time, but you're free to ask me why I think that later. As for the Meno, it is possible in terms of Thomas's thought that he could have read it, but there is simply no real evidence for it. The question of the Timaeus is, I would also like to mention that the translations of the Meno and Phaedo, I've got a note here, they're translated by Henricus Aristippus between 1154 and 1156. The library at Sorbonne had copies of them and a copy of the Timaeus from 1271 onwards. So there's like a remote possibility of Aquinas having like a brief period during which he's in the same place as copies of those dialogues. Of course, there's always a possibility, there's more likelihood for the Timaeus than for those other 2 that he encountered a copy at other periods in his life, but we simply don't have like historic information about that. At least not that I could find. Okay. Moving on to Thomas's engagement with the Timaeus. So whether or not Thomas read the Timaeus himself, he does actually, in fact, engage with it directly. in his writings. In the Decalogue by Aristotle, Aristotle mentions Plato by name once. He mentions the Timaeus, the man, not the dialogue, twice, and he mentions Timaeus, the dialogue, not the man, 3 times. Thomas, in his commentary on the Decalogue, mentions Plato an astonishing 81 times. The Timaeus, the dialogue, not the man, 16 times, and Timaeus, the man, not the dialogue, 2 times. You can easily guess from those numbers that most of Thomas's mention of Plato or Timaeus by name is not in reference to a place where Aristotle was already mentioning them. However, I've gone through each of those citations, and I was able to find an equivalent citation in Simplicius's commentary on the Decalogue. For which reason it does not seem to be evidence of Thomas having read the Timaeus himself. So this paper started out as a paper about Calcidius, and it turned into one in which Simplicius ended up playing a larger role. Nonetheless, I don't think that the possibility of Thomas reading the Timaeus should be entirely ruled out either. For historical reasons, it's at least possible in the sense that there did exist Latin copies, and it was a fairly popular work which had a widespread influence in the Middle Ages. I would also like to mention that if Aquinas read the Timaeus, it does not appear to me that he read the Calcidius' commentary. This is not evidence against him reading the Timaeus, as from the 11th century onwards, it was very common for the two of them not to be included in the same manuscript. So you might have one manuscript with Calcidius' commentary, you might have another manuscript with his translation of the Timaeus. So at this point, I would like to give just a brief little autobiographical background about Calcidius himself. We don't have any historic information about his life. However, references in his work to other works and references by other authors to Calcidius' work allow us to, I have a note on this. They allow us to date his commentaries no earlier than the mid-3rd and no later than the end of the 4th century. It is generally assumed that Calcidius was a Christian. He does make frequent references to Aristotle, to Christian beliefs, to Jewish beliefs, and to Stoic beliefs. He does not explicitly commit himself to any of these sets of beliefs. There is a bit of questionable historical evidence for Calcidius being a Christian, and this is from the 11th century onwards. There is often a scribal note in manuscripts saying that he was a deacon or archdeacon to Osius, who was the person who, according to the note, was a bishop who requested this translation. I find this somewhat questionable. The witnesses which contain this scribal note all date from the 11th century onwards, and it's possible that they are carrying on some earlier tradition. However, Calcidius himself makes many remarks which would seem odd if they are coming from a Christian. I will mention one of these in a few minutes. Now I'd like to give some brief biographical background about Simplicius. So, Simplicius was the intellectual grandson of Proclus. Unfortunately for Simplicius, Proclus died 5 years after Simplicius was born. Simplicius refers to him, however, as the teacher of my teacher. So Simplicius was born, again I turn to my notes, pardon me, around 480 in Asia Minor. He then studied in Alexandria under a certain Ammonius, and then in Athens under Damascus, who was the head of the the Platonic school in Athens. After the school was disbanded, Damascus, Simplicius, and many others went to Persia. And we don't know much biographical information beyond that. He is believed to have died around 560. As you've probably gathered at this point, he wrote many commentaries on Aristotle, but often from a Platonic viewpoint. Just of notice, of interest to us, I'm assuming most of the people at this conference are Catholic. Simplicius was kind of an anti-Christian. He had this sort of like intellectual hatred of John Philoponus in particular. And he has long passages in the Decalo which are just diatribes against John Philoponus. Anyway, so at this, so I'd like to say a few words about the philosophical content of Aquinas' commentary on the Decalo. There are many considerations in there which are probably of very niche interest. So, for instance, he'll mention how Plato believed that the weight of an object corresponds to the number of angles it has, referencing the Timaeus. He talks about how Aristotle believes that fire naturally moves upwards, but Plato in the Timaeus seems to say that fire moves in a circle, but really Plato is actually agreeing with Aristotle because when he says fire, he's actually referring to something else. He takes a very positive view towards both Plato and Aristotle in this commentary. Perhaps one of the topics he treats of that's might be of most interest to philosophers is that of the eternity of the world. So Aquinas states in his commentary on the Decalo, please cut me off because I've kind of lost track of the time. Okay, Thomas Aquinas states in his commentary on the Decalo that Plato believes that the world had a beginning in time, but that it will continue to all eternity. This seems to be a point about Plato which is agreed upon by Simplicius and Aristotle. Just for a point of comparison, Calcidius in his commentary has a somewhat unique take on this. Calcidius seems to believe that this view is philosophically problematic. He does not have a problem with the idea of the physical world being created in time. He has a problem with the world soul being created at the same time as the world body. So this is one of my reasons for doubting that Calcidius is a Christian. These are like very strange viewpoints to hear from a Christian. Osius, who he wrote to, was almost certainly a Christian by remarks that Calcidius makes in the second person. So, according to Calcidius, Calcidius doesn't seem to have a clear view on whether the world's soul must have been created in time, but at any rate, it must have preceded the body. So he gives an interpretation of Plato's words according to which Plato actually thought that the world's soul pre-existed before the world body. However, Plato does not actually say that in the Timaeus. This is still Calcidius. Calcidius is admitting that Plato doesn't say it. So he says that Plato is here telling a noble lie for the sake of the masses who wouldn't be able to understand such a complex chain of events, and Plato decided that it's more important for the masses to know that the world was created than it is for them to know that the world's soul existed before the world's body. Even in the Middle Ages, some people who believed Calcidius to be Christian would remark that he does say some things which sound somewhat odd coming from a Christian. While Calcidius is, of course, here giving interpretation of Plato, at this point he's departing so much from Plato's actual words to reinterpret it that it seems only to make sense that Calcidius is reinterpreting Plato's thought according to what he, Calcidius, believes to be the case. Okay, I'm sorry, I feel I was somewhat bad in timing this. So I think I will let this come to an early close. Yes. Okay. Well, all in all, while I don't think that Aquinas reading the Timaeus can be definitively ruled out, I think that whether or not he actually did read it, given his explicit engagement with it, this is a room for further study. And my next plans for myself, if I were to continue in this, would be to look at a closer, like, philosophical examination of Aquinas's remarks on the philosophy of the Timaeus. Okay, you'll have to bear with me. I'm actually forgetting the conclusion. I forgot what conclusion I was trying to end with, and now I have remembered it. Okay. Despite the paucity of internal evidence for Thomas having read the Timaeus, there is a very interesting piece of external evidence. This is mentioned by Pasquale Porto. So, upon Thomas's death, the arts faculty at Paris wrote to the general chapter of Dominicans asking for things. They asked to be sent relics from Thomas, and then they asked to be sent a large number of books, which apparently Thomas had promised to send to them upon completion of the writing of them. So one of the books he promised to send them was, in fact, his commentary on the De Caelo. He also promised to send multiple works which are not known by us to exist. One of these is a commentary on Simplicius himself. It is not stated in the letter what work of Simplicius he was planning to comment on. And then of interest to us is apparently Thomas promised to write a commentary on the Timaeus itself and to send that commentary to the arts faculty in Paris when it was completed. So this leaves us with some questions, of course. Did Thomas read the Timaeus, but was he cut short from composing a work based on it by his premature death? Was he planning to read the Timaeus? Did he start a commentary which has been lost? I don't think that this is an option which occurs quickly to Thomists, because we were so blessed to have easy access to his works that we assume that we know of the existence of all of those that were. It would be somewhat of a tragedy if there is a lost manuscript of Aquinas, but the history of manuscripts shows that important works are lost all of the time. Or perhaps was the arts faculty just making a mistake? Did they confuse this with the De Caelo commentary in the De Caelo itself, which references the Timaeus so often? Although I am disinclined to go for that explanation myself. So, internal evidence as regards Aquinas reading the Timaeus is somewhat lacking, but there is a very, very, very interesting piece of external evidence, namely that letter.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your paper. I think the idea that perhaps when you can't demonstrate your author has a position from the text, the noble lie line is very productive, and we'll be using that myself in a number of cases. Like I said, we'll have questions. We'll start with questions for Rebecca, and then we'll have a period where anybody can ask anything following this.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that. So my question is just in sort of maybe to pitch an alternative theory, which is not my own. It's from an article by Richard Schenck, who says that if you look at how widely the Timaeus was circulating in mid-13th century Paris, and we know, for example, that Albert quotes it verbatim a number of times, uses it extensively, Schenck kind of just says, or his conclusion is, Aquinas probably read the Timaeus and was insufficiently impressed by it to engage with it further. And now, while that breaks my heart, I'm just curious, do you think Schenck's position can be refuted, or is that sort of just given the paucity of evidence that we have, it's sort of just another option on the table.
Okay. Given the fact that I would like Aquinas to have read the Timaeus, I like the first part of what he said about it's in such wide circulation, though it's very likely Aquinas would have read it. I think for the reason that it was in such wide circulation, we have to say it must have exercised an indirect influence on Aquinas. He surely was at least like talking to people who'd read it. He didn't spend his whole life reading books and writing. He spent his life talking to people, as we're doing now. As regards the speculation that he was unimpressed by it, I think based on the way in which, on the enthusiasm with which he engages in it, when he finds it in Simplicius, I find it very difficult to agree with that. It seems when he encounters it in Simplicius, then he just sort of like copies it from Simplicius' commentary into his own. He had to have Simplicius' commentary at hand while he was writing his own. At times, his own commentary is basically a paraphrase of Simplicius's. And again, the possible promise to write a commentary on the Timaeus. Given that, I cannot agree with it being likely that he was unimpressed by it. Yeah, I myself am confused by it still, so it is Plato's oddest book.
Yeah, thanks very much. There is a commentary by Galen on the Timaeus in the Arabic tradition. Was it translated into Latin? Do you know? Is it available? By the way, it's not a very good commentary.
Yeah, that would be something really good to look into. I don't know anything about whether that was translated, but I'm really glad for you. I'm grateful to you for bringing that to our attention. I just don't know much about it myself.
I have one more for Rebecca, if just to say, I have read something by Carlos Steele that actually, and a few others I believe, that says that reference in the letter from the faculty of Paris is referring to actually an excerpt of Proclus's commentary on the Timaeus that Aquinas had from Marbeck. So like, it's not something he was going to write, but it's a book that he had on his person.
Okay, I haven't read the letter myself, so I was just going with what Pasquale Porto says, but maybe Carlos Steele is more.
And he actually prepared a critical edition of that short piece of text. And
Okay.
it's very limited, though. It's like mainly dealing with prayer and in what ways, why it's relevant to pray to the gods.
Okay, I should look for that article then.
So yeah, I can give the reference.
Yeah, I'd appreciate it very much.
You had also mentioned you had some philosophical reasons why you couldn't have read Phaedo, was it? And I would be interested to hear what those were.
Okay, yes. This actually relates to a paper I gave Saturday at Toronto. Aquinas, in his early career, believes that Platonic forms are limited to the forms of species, so separate man, separate horse, separate dog, etc., etc., etc. He explicitly states this in the De Veritate and then I think the commentary on the sentences. Anyone who's read much Plato knows that this can't be the case. Plato's most preferred, usually when Plato's talking about form, he's talking about something like beauty, justice, etc. Something that for an Aristotelian would not be a substance. For early Aquinas, Platonic forms correspond to like Aristotelian secondary substances. And he's getting this from Aquinas' line in the Metaphysics where he's accusing the Platonists where he's accusing arguments for the Platonists of inconsistency because arguments for the forms lead to forms of things that are not substances. But this goes against even the Platonist's own opinion, which sounds like he's saying that the Platonists restrict forms to the forms of to forms which correspond to the secondary substances. So basically, to answer your question, the Phaedo, when it mentions forms, which is only briefly, it's mentioning forms such as things like justice itself. Aquinas could not have read it and still held to that view. Later, Aquinas arguably might change his mind on this point. So he's now recognizing he doesn't use the word form, but it's clear he's talking about the Platonic doctrine of forms. So briefly in the Summa, then again in the commentary on the divine names, and in the commentary on the Book of Causes, and in the De Substantiis Separatis, he's attributing he presents a sort of Platonic theory of the forms, even if he doesn't use the word form, and then he says this applies not only to things like man or horse, but also things like life itself, one itself, the good itself, wisdom itself, whatever. The Platonists are using the same reasoning about these. So this seems like a radical change of his view about the range of Plato's forms. The reason I hesitate to fully commit to saying that he changed his mind is that he reiterates the former view when he's commenting on Aristotle's metaphysics, when he's commenting on that line, although, of course, the context, it makes sense if he's going to refer that again, it will be there. But basically, the Phaedo would have destroyed that earlier interpretation of Plato. If he read the Phaedo, I think it would have been at the very end of his life. The Meno, it's unclear. The Timaeus is compatible with, among all Platonic dialogues, is probably the one least likely to destroy that earlier interpretation of Plato, just because Plato in the Timaeus does seem to actually be focusing more on the forms of substances, or at least of natural kinds. It can be a little unclear. He does seem to also like reference a form of like the sun or the moon, which are not individuals within a species, but they seem to have some sort of like exemplar to them. So basically, I think that the Phaedo is incompatible with Aquinas' early interpretation of Plato, not necessarily with his late interpretation of Plato.
Well, thank you. So I think now we can move on to our more general Q&A follow-up. So I know we had a number of people, and we'll work our way back into the room if that's all right.
Thank you very much for both of your talks. My question is for Father Snyder. My own work with participation and the tripartite Platonic structure of participated perfection, principle of participation, really works with the infused virtues, and even Aquinas' understanding of the natural law as nothing other than the eternal laws, participatio in the rational creature. This is going to be either I hope it's an easy question. It's one I need for my own work. When does Aquinas first get a copy of Proclus? And a slight follow-up.
June of
question.
1268.
1268?
Most likely. Marbeck had the great, this actually is on a personal note. It seemed like he finished his translations June or July in Rome, and I can understand why, because you really can't do any more work after a little while. And so he dated them. At the end, even in the manuscript, you find the date. Now you have to adjust because the calendar is a bit different, but the summer of 1268.
Perfect.
Now, if he had as a quick qualifier, and it's relevant to that letter sent by the faculty of Paris at his death, he may have read a short excerpt from the Timaeus commentary of Proclus that Marbeck translated much earlier. It's sort of, the jury is out on that one. But that would be the only other thing of Proclus that we would know of.
And then a follow-up question. Norris Clark makes the claim that Aquinas synthesizes his act potency understanding with participation in Book 2 of the Contra Gentiles. And here you've got it in the separated substances. Only my own ignorance, what's the dating versus the one or the other?
That's much earlier, so this
Okay.
would be much later.
Which one is it?
So De Substantiis is much later. It's around 1272. The Summa Contra Gentiles is 1260s, early 1260s, maybe for any folks in the 61 and after. So you're right that I'm not saying that Aquinas got this theory completely from Proclus. I'm just saying that if there's some explanation for why he may have been in more of a spirit of setting things in concord, he would have had support in Proclus for a Platonist comfortable noticing a close connection. Frankly, I could stop at that. A Platonist using the language of potency and act in some connection to efficient causality within a framework of participation. And the propositions to look at are 77 through 79. That's just something offered as a further explanation. I think he has his own theory of participation worked out a little bit earlier, or more clearly defined a bit earlier, though I think it reaches a higher definition in the later works. And I agree with Fabro that the De Substantiis is probably Aquinas' best articulation of his theory of participation, and not in the text I've given you, but in some of the other chapters.
No, thank you very much. I'm just a simple country moral theologian, and history comes much harder to me. So thank you.
Thanks. Thank you to both of our panelists for this great panel. So this question's also for Father Raymund. So you said toward the end of your talk that Aquinas in the De Substantiis Separatis has this sort of conciliating tendency to bring Aristotle and Plato together. And partly that sounds right to me, but then partly I wonder if you want to qualify that a bit more. So here's an example that sort of stands out to me as sort of paradigmatic of his approach in the commentary on De Causis and also on De Substantiis Separatis, where so this is when he talks about self-knowledge. And he says that, so he gives this sort of top-down theoretical consideration in terms of the types of approaches that you could have to self-knowledge of a soul. And then he says that depending on how you think of where the species come from, you could either take the way of Aristotle or you could take the way of the Platonists. So there's a way in which he's bringing them together because he's putting them together as part of a single tradition. But then it also seems to think of them as occupying these different competing branches of this same peripatetic tradition. And I'm wondering just what your thoughts are on the broader characterization of how they're similar but also different. Because one of the, I can't remember if this is Henley or Hankey who makes this point, but that Aquinas starts using this language of the Platonists to talk about a tradition relatively later in his life, actually just before the Elements is translated. So there seems to be some sort of shift in his understanding of Platonism as a tradition, as opposed to this kind of like, just Plato as a guy who's Aristotle is disagreeing with, and they're all on the same team in some way, or else they're fundamentally opposed, but they're just two people that are disagreeing, and he's thinking more in terms of traditions and in terms of what they have in common and what they're... So I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Yes. Could I ask just a quick question about the first part of the question? Do you have in mind the reditio completa issue in the De Causis? Is that what you have in mind?
Yeah, so
Okay.
that's... Yes, right. Yeah, and then there's a parallel discussion. Yeah.
So to answer, while it's still fresh, the last part of the question, I suspect that if this is illustrated anything, I think it's the necessity of a dissertation on Simplicius and Aquinas, this panel session. I do think because he gets the commentary on the categories of Simplicius, and as a lot of commentaries in the categories, it has this long prologue about different traditions, and he gets that quite a bit early. I think we even see the impact of that, let's say, in the De Spiritualibus Creaturis. So I think that's in the equation. I don't know exactly when he begins to start to refer to the Platonists as a group, or more frequently does so. But I suspect it begins there.
There's at least a reference in the Summa Theologiae and
Okay.
the Prima Pars.
In the Prima Pars,
Yeah.
yeah. So that would be consonant with Cat. He didn't have Proclus when he wrote the Prima Pars, but he would have had probably that commentary of Simplicius. So, and he makes some other comments about the Platonists in On Spiritual Creatures that make us think it's not quite as much information as he gets from Proclus, but it's enough that he's developing an idea of what Platonism is in his mind that's more that's fuller than he had previously. Yeah, is there anything else in that question I should answer?
Yeah, so I mean, then in the text you were looking at, your impression is that
Mhm.
he's conciliating the two traditions.
That's right.
But then it also seems to me, maybe this is just, sample size, but yeah.
And I think it's important to understand the structure. I think to answer that, yes, he does make efforts to point out the differences between Plato and Aristotle, and also the errors of either one and both. But those come out later, and I would say the way that the treatise is structured is important for us to see. It's not really until about chapter 11 that he begins to say critical things about the Platonic position. Even then, he has some complementary things to say, and that's mainly in the context of the Noetic Triad, and he's kind of following Dionysius' critique of the Noetic Triad. So I think the key is he's designed the work, and I agree with Henley in this way, and we need to see this framework of the work itself and the genre. He's set up the work in such a way that Plato and Aristotle are presented as these kind of twin authorities against which everyone else is judged, but even they themselves are subject to critique, and primarily by means of the faith and the truth of things, which he sees Dionysius as more firmly, of course, rooted in. It's only to say that I almost imagine him wanting to say, if all of these other philosophers like Ibn Gabriel and others who he takes the time to critique, if they were a little more like Plato and Aristotle, they wouldn't have fallen into their errors. That's not to say Plato and Aristotle knew everything there was to know about the angels, and but he kind of almost lets them do some of the first line of defense in correcting the errors, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Thank you to both speakers. I also have a question for Father Raymund. Actually, it's building off of the last round of Q&A. I may have misunderstood, but I want to double check. I understood the discussion going back and forth at one point was, it sounded as if it was being said that Aquinas backs away from the triadic structure of participation, where there's participant, what's participated, and the unparticipated, and returns to the dyadic. Is that the take?
That's my understanding from...
I would respectfully kind of push back on that.
Oh, I'd love to hear the pushback, yeah.
Okay, good. So, because that's what I understood Christopher to be saying. So, yeah, early on, I think right from the beginning, he's got that, because it's already in the commentary in the sentences what Christopher was bringing out, that he talks about three aspects. There's the participant, the participated, and the principle of participation. And then in his commentary on the divine names, he follows Dionysius in saying God is unparticipated. What struck me in my own research is, we're done a disservice with our English word participation, because I think we treat certain shun words, T-I-O-N, as active. And so you could think like possession. Possession is 9/10 of the law. So having the thing, that's it. Versus possession, I guess it's an S-I-O-N word, but possession, like this is my possession. It's something had, right? And so the passive sense. And when Aquinas uses participatio, what I've noticed is he's almost always using it in the passive sense. So participatio is something that's had, so that he'll call an accident a participatio, and a being's own esse, its inner actus essendi, a participatio. And so that's why he'll say, God is unparticipated, because if he were participated, he would be a participatio that's in the participant. He'd be entering into composition with the participant, so that would be problematic. So I throw that out there. And then, in fact, I would say, I think one of the texts you have here actually brings that out. If we look on, I guess it's side B, the first text there, the English has it a few lines down. Something receives what it participates from that which it participates in. So that sounds like it's participating in the source, but actually the Latin, omne autem participans, every participant, aliquid accipit, receives something, receives that which it participates, id quod participat, from that a quo participat, from that from which it
yeah.
participates.
Well, the Latin is my own, so.
Okay. Yeah, so it just encourages,
make
I
no,
think it actually,
yeah.
this text supports the triadic notion that it's not participating in the source, it's receiving what it participates from the source.
Thank you for that, and actually I will adjust the translation there. I guess what I had in mind, we could say, obviously, what's the threat of a triadic participation? Well, it's when we reify and make subsistent the participations themselves. So in those contexts, which Aquinas has in mind in the commentary on the De Causis, as though there's a self-subsistent participation that isn't possessed or given,
Right.
that's just sort of floating. That's
Exactly.
when we have multiple gods.
We
as
don't want to
problems.
reify it as a subsistent entity, but in a
Right.
qualified sense, we want to reify it as a principle inside the participant.
Exactly.
And it's a likeness of the source. And in that way, the participant participates in a likeness of its source. But that's just a small point relative to your whole talk,
No,
which
I think it's a
I
very
loved.
important one. It's a
Yeah.
very important one. Thank you.
I'm just working from memory here, but doesn't St. Augustine use the term Platonists? I'm thinking he doesn't see God.
And not only that, now it's coming to mind in the De Aeternitate Mundi treatise, Aquinas is clearly drawing on Augustine for a certain type of Platonist or philosopher. So, yeah.
Well, I also want to remind everybody that one of the main guides to understanding Platonism was Augustine's short chapter on Dei Deis, 83 different questions as well. Everyone knew that, because it was one of the few really clear sources that they had. Harry had mentioned the Arabic tradition having some material as well. Avicenna talks about Plato, the Plato forms, in Book 7 of the Metaphysics. There's quite a bit of talk about Plato. But I want to go back a little earlier, since Dionysus has been mentioned several times. And Dionysus was available well before Thomas's birth, right? And studied very carefully. And yet we know what the background of Dionysus. We know what the background of Dionysus is. We're getting some form of a Platonism of some kind in Dionysus. So on the Arabic side, so Dionysus is a 6th century figure, I think it's fair to say. And the Academy closes in 529. The philosophers move east. And a lot of the philosophy then is absorbed into Syriac Christianity and discussions of Syriac Christianity. And so for a long time, I'm going to move off in other directions for a moment, but with some history. For a long time, we've been trying to figure out where the Arabic translation of Plotinus's Enneads, this thesis of it, really came from, and who translated it. We're pretty sure the translator is Ibn Naima, a Christian from Emesa. Well, he's likely a Christian who was trilingual, that is Syriac, Greek, and Arabic. and he's modifying it in accord. So we had a seminar in Marquette a week ago with Joseph Puig Montado from Madrid, and he was examining the early Galen and sort of material. And what we find, I'm straining it, but I'll come back. What we find with the early Galen version of the Timaeus is the Christians who are doing the translating, people who are looking at this, are changing it into a doctrine of creation. It's absolutely a doctrine of creation. And so
It's like Chartres 700 years earlier or something.
Something like that. But Puig pointed this out and then was going to say that the translation of the Arabic Plotinus and Libri Causis material at that time what was translated was transformed by the Christians at the time as they were translating it, but I don't want to lose track of time here because we have 6th century, 6th, 7th, 8th centuries. We have rise of science and philosophy in Syria and medicine as well. But the theologians are working in Palestine, all sorts of different places, and different versions of Christianity as well. But these people are trilingual. That is, so there was one that was Theodore of Abukura, who could read the Greek. He was a theologian at Haran, a bishop at Haran, till he got booted for some reason. And then he moved into the Syriac community living in Baghdad and brought philosophy with him. But he could read the Greek originals and discuss it. Of course he could read the Greek because of the liturgy. And they in fact were reading Proclus and others know that because of Dionysus. But they're also reading Dionysus and adapting Dionysus to all this. So if this is a strange, there's a transmission here of ideas that's coming in. But for about 200 years then, the Christians have been dealing with Neoplatonism and making it to fit Christian doctrine. And the manifestation of that again is Dionysus, but many others as well. So when that material comes through, the Timaeus is lost in a sense. It's become a doctrine of creation as well. But Dionysus is playing a huge role in the thinking of people at that time in the 9th century, earlier before the 9th century. That's all settled. And then materials come through, and it's already been modified to fit a new version of Aristotle, who of course was, as the Alexandrians wanted, Aristotle is in agreement with Plato, etc. So that's coming through as well. So I'm wondering about the sources, the various sources of Platonism and Dionysus himself. Dionysus is already there and study. Oh, and the other thing I was going to mention also, which you know quite well, is Thomas happened to study Dionysus very closely with his teacher Albert. And Albert, in commenting on Dionysus, does a couple of interesting things. He says Dionysus the philosopher, which I was shocked to see that. And then he helps when talking about being. He makes reference to the Liber de Causis and Avicenna to explicate Dionysus. So Aquinas is filtering all this material through in many ways.
I agree. And if the point maybe could be summarized as we can't just locate one source of this concordizing influence, I actually, what I understand from the things you shared, I am sympathetic to, especially something related is Christina d'Ancona's thesis that because of the Syriac Christian community, Dionysus being popular among them, there's even a kind of bridge one can make between Dionysus and the De Causis.
There's no question about it, yes.
And so that this Arabic philosopher in Baghdad is not creating this out of whole cloth, but in fact relying on a tradition. I guess I kind of want to back things up a bit and even maybe frame the question this way: why was someone like Proclus attractive to Aquinas? Because whether Richard Schenk's thesis is true about the Timaeus, we know the opposite is true about Proclus, that he found something interesting in Proclus. And I think we can see that part of that is because so much of the elements feels Aristotelian, because it is at a certain level. And then to take that further, I think a lot of the alterations that Dionysius makes to Proclus aren't just Christian monotheistic alterations, they're Aristotelian. A further step in that direction. So I just think it's worth commenting on some of the text. The project I was trying today to do is simply to highlight that we can already see some of this conciliation within the elements that may push Aquinas in a certain direction in that context. But I agree, and
Well, there's another factor to put into this as well. I want to disagree with the way you phrase it, why Aquinas was interested in Proclus. Because why was Proclus translated?
because William Marbeck decided to.
Why did Marbeck decide to translate it?
He had really good intuitions. That's why. Well, I actually don't know the answer to that question.
I actually know the answer. answer is because he already knew the Liber de Causas, and he found this. And then he put it into Aquinas' lap. And then Aquinas could proceed. It's not by accident, because everyone had to know the Liber de Causas.
Right. It was part of the curriculum at that point.
Absolutely. So I want to switch it around.
Yeah.
So why did Aquinas take interest? Because he'd been using the Liber de Causas to talk about being and many other things, and creation, that God alone gives being, while other things give form, which is a strange thing as well. But he took that over for himself as well. So I think the reason Rebecca found the source of the De Causas and handed it to Thomas. And then Thomas does the explication.
And I've seen this, presented in a few different places, and I agree with kind of Sefre's way of articulating it, which is that even if someone helped him, I'm sorry, I may be confusing Fanstein Kistake, but it's one of them. Even if Aquinas had help in figuring out this connection, he's really the one to make the discovery, maybe not the initial discovery, but to demonstrate the discovery and to really show definitively the dependencies, proposition by proposition, of the De Causas on the elements. But I agree, it seems very likely he had help in that. Why else take interest, right?
This is a fascinating combination of things going on.
Plus, we don't know when that excerpt of the commentary on the Timaeus hit Aquinas' desk. We know he died with it, at least if we follow Steele's thesis, but it could have been there much earlier than 1268. And that's the sort of unknown, and that's kind of one of those things I've had my eyes open for, is there an indication he had, at least this section from the Timaeus commentary on prayer, why pray to the gods if they're not going to change, as one of the issues, and whether that can be detected in Aquinas. Maybe knowing that piece of the Timaeus also made the elements more interesting to him. It's possible.
Like the last time we met, we have more to talk about. This one.
Yeah, great. Look forward to it.
I have a question if there's time for Father Snyder. Is that okay with you?
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned that you believe the De Substantiis Separatis was not contemporaneous with the commentary on the Liber de Causas, which is something I'm already inclined to agree with. But my question is, as regards the dating of the commentary on the divine names, as no doubt you're aware, the sort of default assumption among scholars, and you're probably also aware that Henke disagrees with this, has been to assume that was shortly prior to 1268, based on the assumption that it was before he read Proclus, based on the fact that he doesn't mention Proclus by name in there. And I am inclined to think that it was either very close in time or contemporaneous to his commentary on the Liber de Causas, because there are really striking similarities, and there's a lot of parallel things that he says. And I don't think the lack of the mention of Proclus by name is as much of a problem as many scholars think.
I agree with the principle of Henke's argument there, that it wouldn't necessarily be right to even mention Proclus in a commentary on Dionysius being this quasi-biblical figure that he was. So I don't think the absence of Proclus's name in the commentary is proof that he didn't have Proclus yet. Plus, I agree with you.
Can I insert one more
Go
thing? The commentary on the divine names by Sir Dionysius is also unusual in that Aquinas almost entirely, not entirely, but it's almost entirely is engaging only with Dionysius, and it's very rare for him to cite other authors in that commentary at all, in contrast to what we're used to from a lot of his other works. So I think that's another reason that the lack of mention of Proclus is not a problem, because he's not doing much mentioning of anybody.
Excellent.
I'll let you continue.
No, thank you. And I do think that the commentary on the divine names is just one of those works that still remains uncertain. I think a Leonine edition will help, but I don't even know that will settle things. We should mention that we're lacking the Leonine edition.
Yeah, I've looked at two manuscript copies, and one of them is very, very, very close to the Maritain edition. I think that's, and then the other is very, very, has a lot of really big different textual differences, although the thought basically remains the same. But yeah, so my point is, yeah, we do need scholarly work starting from the manuscripts and early printed editions.
Excellent. Yes, and just to say I'm sympathetic to Hankey's position. I just would much rather move the commentary on divine names later than move Aquinas' reading of Proclus earlier, which is what he, at least, it's funny, he articulates one position, he changes it, and then he changes back, if you look at the dating of certain articles. So I really think the idea that Marbeck gave Aquinas these draft translations ahead of time that we have no record of, I just don't think is enough to leverage an argument. So I'd much rather push the dating of the divine names commentary later, after 1268, if that's possible.
It's a sort of speculation. I don't think we have a strong enough reason to.
Right. But I agree. Yeah, it seems as though he has help in the background when he's writing that commentary. But I again don't know that text well enough, as many of the people in this room.